Okay, great. So let us remind ourselves of task number 2 for control mapping and control library management skill. And this is ranked as the number 2 GRC skill to have as a GRC professional. So here we have the task given a requirement, example, access reviews. Awesome. So let us put this within a case scenario context. So if we look at this, for example, here, this is our lab. And it says that you're a GRC analyst at FinServ MENA. And the scenario is that audit findings states that access reviews are not consistently performed. Therefore, you are tasked with mapping this to SOC 2, map this SOC 2 to NIST, define control objectives, identify 5 evidence artifacts, and recommend remediation. So the key thing has to do with the crosswalk, and crosswalk is simply a mapping process where you compare or you look at, for example, SOC 2, the structure of the framework, the requirements, the various control structures or families, and then you align these against another framework. In this case, it's NIST, and what those control families are, or it could also be ISO 27001. It could also be against GDPR or HIPAA. So a crosswalk is simply a mapping, one control to the next control, and what the requirements are, what evidence needs to be provided, what documentations need to be provided to have the synergy between these two framework or standard requirements. Now, there is a logic that you need to bear in mind when it comes on to doing your mappings. Of course, we are working within the context of this scenario. So here we have controls don't exist for compliance. They exist to prove governance is actually working. And the mapping logic that you need to bear in mind is that here we have start with the requirements. What are the requirements? For example, what must the business achieve? Then you move on to mapping this to your framework. And this could be SOC 2. And this answers the question of what does assurance expect? And then you move on to mapping this framework to another framework. For example, map to NIST. What technical control domain does it belong to? And of course, identify evidence. What proves it actually happens? So this is the logic when it comes on to your framework mapping. Of course, within this particular context, but even outside of the context, that's the logic. So here we have, for example, the approach requirements mapped to the criteria, which is then mapped to control family and evidence artifact. That's the guideline. And I've developed a very wonderful template structure that is designed to give you that hands-on capability when it comes on to having a very, very good crosswalk or framework mapping structure in place for your organization. So here you are, for example, this is made up of your crosswalk register, your evidence tracker, your risk register dashboard, heat map, and suggested various tasks. So this is additional details that you can also delve into. So once you have your list, there's some of the critical things, for example, evidence status. These are information, data that are going to be referenced using formulas from other elements within this template. So here we have our crosswalk. And this might seem a little bit confusing at the get-go, but as you begin to build your skill set, then this will become very easy. And bear in mind that in many organizations, there are well-established frameworks. Sorry, not frameworks, but rather GRC systems or platforms that make this far more easier. And I've also developed a course looking at practical compliance management for GRC professionals, which helps you with doing your compliance management. We are provided with a free version of a GRC platform that allows you to develop your GRC skills when it comes on to working in various frameworks, mappings, and the list goes on. So in a crosswalk register, there are various domains within security or GRC or within these various frameworks. All of these are classified according to domains. So you have example, identity and access management, you have monitoring and logging, you have incident response, you have change management, and this goes on. These are the various domains. And for each domain, you have various requirements. So domains, requirements, in SOC 2, these are the relevant class or family. So these are the various family or families that exist within these frameworks or standards. So here we have, for example, SOC 2. We have CC6, CC7, 8, and the list goes on. The corresponding within the NIST family, you have, for example, access control represented by AC. And the list goes on. So these are the families. These are the matching or crosswalk family relations that exist. So if you go to SOC 2 and you want to find the access reviews requirements, then you go to CC6. If you want to find the same thing in this, you go to AC. So these are the control intent. Ensure access remains appropriate. So these are the various domains that we are focusing on. Those are the relevant families. So once you have all of these aligned, these are the necessary evidence that you need or the organization needs to have in place. And of course, all of this would fall under within your overall GRC program management, control management, that captures all of this information in a program that is repeatable. And of course, primary evidence, your secondary evidence, the frequency of collection or reviews. Then the next thing in this, you would have your owners who is responsible for all of these necessary controls and evidence that are provided. So your job is to ensure that all of this is documented. So this is the template or framework that you can also use. This will give an idea of what this actually looks like within the real world. Your crosswalk, having your mappings, the owners, the status in terms of whether or not these controls are actually implemented, the level of maturity in terms of the degree to which they're implemented, the evidence you have collected. All of this information helps to provide assurance as it relates to auditing. If you can recall, we previously mentioned that's one of the main things is to have all of this in place to provide that assurance when it comes down to auditing purposes. Awesome. So once you establish your crosswalk, you have all of the necessary requirements for your frameworks in place, the necessary controls. You also want to have your evidence tracker in place. And your evidence tracker, look at all of the artifacts that exist. Those are the artifacts names, their types, who owns these artifacts, whether or not they are accepted, they score, where they are located. And in many instances, these systems are designed whereby you can easily click on these as hyperlinks that takes you to the location of these evidence. And you have your notes and what is overdue rather. Great, having a little bit of tongue twister there. Awesome. So with that in place, then we have our evidence tracker. Goes back to your risk register, and of course you could have a link between that previous risk register that we had established in this overall file. So all of these would have been linked information from one file to the next. Your risk IDs, the requirements, what the risks are, bearing in mind that the purpose of your crosswalk or your controls is to address the various risks that have been identified initially. Mitigation plan, you have your owner. So the key thing is to have the design, the outline, know what information needs to go where. Great. So once that is in place, bearing in mind that we are addressing this case or finding audit, finding access reviews, and we are putting the necessary mappings in place to address to ensure that we have necessary controls. All right. So this is an idea or an example of what this executive GRC dashboard could look like. So bearing in mind that the senior management executives are not interested in all of this information. From the get-go, they want to have the plain dashboard that they can see, okay, we have total requirements, 43, 14 of which have been implemented. There's a gap that needs to be filled. Average maturity for the organization, the evidence acceptance receive, overdue evidence, open risk, average residual risk, and area of the various status. All of these have various formula calculation. Of course, once you have a good understanding or good grasp of Excel, then all of this will make sense in terms of the various formulas, in terms of what is happening on each of these. So you have your evidence, the status, plain, straight off the bat view of what is happening within the organization. Maturity in terms of training where you are, business requirements, and of course, once you click on this, click on filter, it tells you where the information is coming from, the source of the information, the various files that are being used in this. And I'm doing this because I want you to develop an ability to think, to reason, to look beyond the surface of things as a GRC professional. So you can simply break this apart, copy, paste, try to rebuild this heat map or this dashboard that can be used in your presentation. So you have your NIST family, all of these, you have your gap, partial controls. Bear in mind that the aim of this course is not to build or to go into all of these in depth. This in of itself is an entire course module training that goes into actually building all of these from scratch. So I'm giving you the resources, the tools that you can actually use to play around with, to see, to have an understanding, so that you have a baseline to work from. So when you get in an organization, at least you can say, okay, I'm not starting from scratch. I have something that I can reference to design, to present to management from the get-go. And of course, an example of an heat map that you can also use in your organization. So the key thing is to understand what a crosswalk actually looks like. And of course, going back to our case scenario, the mapping structure, and by doing this, then we would have addressed this particular task. We looked at the given task, the access review, mapping this to SOC 2, looking at the criteria, mapping this to NIST, looking at the various families, the evidence that exists, and also going beyond what is established here. So with that said, then you're at a very good place in terms of developing your skill sets as it relates to risk assessment and risk register operations, control mapping, and control library management. Now, with that said, then we are then moving on to audit readiness and evidence management in the next segment. So see you then.